Productivity Commission has released a draft report requested by the Australian Government on our workplace relations system. Whether you're employed or not employed, in training or even considering retirement, there's every prospect that right up until very late in your life, you will be taking decisions that are ruled by this system. So this report is important to just about all Australians. Our review has recognised two distinctive features of the Australian labour market: that it affects people's lives and their expectations for their future and that of their families, and that most often employees alone are not as strong as employers in bargaining for reasonable workplace treatment. Australia has a unique system for managing workplace relations. Our awards-based system started because of serious and at times violent disputation between employer and employee well over 100 years ago. And disputes, as a consequence, became a good way of gaining coverage under an award. And another dispute gave birth to the concept of a minimum wage, a sum sufficient for a working man to support his family and settled by a court. So our wages system had two major influences. Judges were the decision makers, and disputes were often the way that improvements were made, which contributed, consequently, to our long history of strikes. Up until the 1990s, we were tagged as a very strike-prone nation. But since then, strikes have fallen, due to influences including enterprise bargaining, a system not rooted in dispute. And the system has become much more national in its coverage. So most of us now are under the one national system. And there have been other successes in the last 20 years. Most people who become unemployed are not out of work for that long. And wage breakouts no longer occur as they did in the past. Generally, the Australian economy as a whole has been better off over the last 20 years or so under the revised system, which offers more flexibility to all parties. No less an authority than the Reserve Bank of Australia has noted just this. This word flexibility, though, is a bit of an issue. Everyone is in favour of flexibility, but one person's flexibility is another person's loss of certainty. And in search of flexibility, some exploitation of workers under individual agreements occurred in the relatively recent past. We can and should have safeguards against that. Our report has examined the case for making improvements to this system, and overall, we find much is working well. We need to repair it, we don't need to replace it. The minimum wage share is high in Australia relative to many other countries. But all countries have unique mixes of social welfare and minimum wage arrangements that together attempt to help the lowest income earners find and keep employment. No country is just right. The evidence in Australia is not great, but overall the Productivity Commission has concluded that small increases in our minimum wage do not seem to have serious effects on employment. Nevertheless, there is a risk of that. Growing youth unemployment is a good example. And no one currently represents the unemployed effectively in the processes that establish the minimum wage. That certainly needs to change. To do this, and to generally improve its ability to set a price for work that affects hundreds of separate award wages across the country, the Fair Work Commission needs to become a different kind of body. One with much greater use of economic and social analysis of its own, and less dependent on what is submitted to it by employers and unions. And we recommend this, not just for setting the minimum wage, but for all those parts of the Fair Work Commission's actions that set wages and conditions. A renewed institution is needed for the kind of labour market we will have in the future. The Fair Work Commission is a powerful economic and social organisation. It needs to have, and to rely more upon, its own capabilities to judge the effects it is likely to have on the Australian economy, just like the Reserve Bank does. Some people have suggested that awards, the unique way we once used to set wages via dispute settlement in each industry, should be abolished. Other nations, such as the UK and New Zealand, have done just that. Yet we find awards are very important in some industries where enterprise bargaining has yet to take hold. Not just to unions, some employers are quite keen to retain them. And more generally, without them, we may not have sound benchmarks for assessing whether new agreements are acceptable. So we propose to retain awards and to improve them as a key part of the workplace safety net. We should also alter the process of award modernisation to focus on areas of significant improvement, determined by analysis, and not by the claims of one party or another. Now, awards are already on a reform pathway in Australia. They are fewer in number, they're easier to understand, and most important, they are becoming less of an impediment to new forms of work and innovation. This work must continue, but better focused on removing out-of-date judgments. In company with awards, legislation establishes standards for hours of work and forms of leave and similar matters. These standards, the National Employment Standards, are generally well regarded, and they too should remain in place with some improvements. Together, reformed awards and the National Employment Standards form core parts of the safety net in workplace relations. But there are fallen logs blocking the reform pathway in both awards and the NES. The most prominent of these is penalty rates for weekend work. There is a good case for extra payments for those who work at times that most of us would prefer not to. And there is no case for changing penalty rates for essential services, where community attitudes established long ago have not shifted. But there is good information to show in some industries we have the payment structured wrongly. For those who work abnormal hours, including weekends, the social and personal cost to them is greatest from evening and night shift. And Saturdays and Sundays, not so much. But the penalty rates are set the other way around. Set many years ago to deter weekend work, these rates now just deter weekend services that as a society we increasingly want. This is particularly so for the cafe, hospitality, entertainment, restaurant and retailing industries. And the retailing industry is shown up here. The trends over the last 30 years are pretty clear. Saturday and Sunday are now just about the same in retailing. Our recommendation is that the Fair Work Commission determine that the Sunday rate be made equal to the Saturday rate for these industries. Of course, like every regulated rate in an award, employers can and do pay more for better quality of work. So the new rate would be a floor and not a maximum. We looked at public holidays too. Here the penalty rate is not the issue. They should stay. The issue is instead about simple loss of productivity from unilateral declaration of new holidays. State governments should still be able to declare new holidays, preferably after considering the costs and benefits. But employers should not be required to pay, under the National Employment Standards, beyond current numbers of such holidays. And there are also ways to have some additional flexibility about when to take a public holiday, to swap one date for another, if employees and employers agree. Not all public holidays are the same. For some, the original purpose has been lost. The Queen's birthday holiday is not celebrated on the Queen's birthday, and it varies by state. We don't propose that the rates of pay for public holidays like these be varied. If you have to work on a new date for a public holiday, you should be paid the penalty rate. We do see value in allowing employees and employers to choose to swap to a better date for a public holiday from one that has little intrinsic meaning today. There are gains here for both employers, trading on days when many people have a day off, or meeting tight project deadlines, and for employees, such as having a day to add to their vacation. Unfair dismissal laws in Australia have a bad name. There are lots of critical anecdotes, and some of these are even true. But the system serves an essential purpose. Mostly, the scope to exploit it lies with inconsistency in decision making and with people, properly dismissed, still receiving a payment due to simple process mistakes by an employer. It fails to pass any common sense test that a person dismissed for what is agreed to be unacceptable behaviour in the workplace is still compensated for a minor procedural issue. We propose that the Fair Work Commission is not bound by this sort of rule and focuses instead on the substance of the issue and not the form. The single largest shift of approach we advocate in this report is in the nature of the institution that determines many of these decisions. Now, the Fair Work Commission has done good work in successfully reducing over 3,000 awards to 122. But history and precedent play too large a part And independent research and analysis plays too small a part in decisions that affect such a large part of the economy. We recommend it is restructured to have two separate groups to focus on its primary areas of work: a modern dispute resolution entity and an analytical body addressing significant social and economic questions. Restructuring will strengthen the Fair Work Commission. It will offer a foundation for many of our key recommendations on the minimum wage, on a new process for modernising awards, on the reform of weekend penalty rates. But this shows how important it is for the recommendations we make on restructuring to be implemented in full. Small businesses dominate the Australian business structure by number and are significant employers. They are not, however, big participants in enterprise bargaining. Enterprise bargains involve potentially lengthy exchanges with the regulator and unions, both of which have more experience in setting and navigating the process than a small business. We have designed a concept that may assist those small businesses which would like to remake an award to suit their business but don't want to breach the law. It's put up for consideration. Migrant workers are more vulnerable to exploitation than other members of the Australian workforce. Better penalties are required to deter this exploitation. And the Fair Work Ombudsman should receive additional resourcing to help with this. The Ombudsman is a key part of the safeguards in the system. Finally, this report also includes a number of recommendations that address flaws in the bargaining process and how businesses and unions behave towards each other. Most of these will not affect the majority of firms or unions. They deal with behaviour that is not that common, but when it does occur can be very harmful. Some of them will also help the Fair Work Commission apply better judgment. The law can be too inflexible for modern circumstances. The celebrated example where a wage negotiation had to be started all over again simply because two documents were stapled together is an extreme example, but one that is simply unnecessary and undesirable in a modern system. The Productivity Commission has put balance in bargaining between employer and employee first in framing this report. It's a draft report, and some positions we take may well change in the light of new information. We have made some formal information requests in this draft, and we hope we can get information from you. You can find the report at pc.gov.au.